Welcome to the Renaissance and welcome to Arochukwu Never Conducted Slave Raids Part 4. And this very important notice to you, our dear viewer, that it is never our intention to offend anyone with our videos. It is not also our intention to suggest, insinuate, or preach hate towards any group, race, tribe, or person. There is also no propaganda or any deliberate attempt to misinform anyone with our videos. Please look for the books, journals, magazines, or other publications or sources referenced and study them yourself. Remember, to control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and your history, he needs no prison walls and no chains to hold you. John Henrik Clark. And from Cardinal Lavigeri, the captured Negroes are exhibited for sale like cattle. Their feet, hands, and teeth are looked at, and all their limbs examined to see what work can be got out of them. The price to be given for them is discussed in their presence, just as if it were a question of purchasing some brute beast, and the sum agreed upon being paid. They belong body and soul to the man who bought them. Permit us then to ask you, do you not wonder how millions of people could have been forcibly taken from their homes and millions also killed in the process, and no one knows who did? If the slave trade has actually ended, and why both the slave master and his slave hunting partners are always lying about what could have transpired back then, and why the descendants of the slave hunters are always on the side of the slave masters and against the Negroes, while at the same time claiming to be brothers with them. Recall from previous parts of this series that the descendants of the slave hunters claim that the slave trade had not ended by 1921, but our challenge to them is to tell us who was buying the slaves, since the Europeans had outlawed the slave trade and had stopped buying slaves at that time. So if they claim that the slave trade had continued up till 1921, when Europe had ended theirs and no one else was buying from the slave hunters, we challenged them to tell us who was buying the slaves they were capturing. Remember, when we say slaves, slaves are human. They have to eat, they have to defecate, they have to drink water, they have to at least be kept. So how could they have sustained the slave trade as at 1921 when the Europeans and Arabs had stopped buying the slaves? And please note that if they claim that they were still buying, albeit secretly, they need to provide us with the source of that information, wherever they got them from. And then they also made claims of how millions could have been sold from a tiny portion of land mass which is today called southeastern Nigeria. Please remember that the slave master and his slave hunting partners are working to further divide the southeastern part the same way they divided the southern part in order to further their conquest of the Negroes and other groups living in the same area. And we also saw alibis based on formation of Sokoto in 1804, whereas the Fulani had arrived in the area in the 13th century, and Sokoto was only formed because the slave masters were working to encourage them to stop slave hunting and slave raiding and embrace something different from what they have been doing. Hence the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate on Hausa land, while ruled by the Fulanis, who are alien to the area. You may also recall that we have been trying to prove that the Aro did not have the capacity to conduct slave raids. We also saw the descendants of the slave hunters argue that a bunch of priests could have conducted slave raids without a standing army. And when they saw that that couldn't fly, they started claiming that they contracted a so-called urban warriors to conduct slave raids for them. Remember, they have never provided any account of such raids, but have based all their arguments on the book called Among the Igbos, published in 1921, and that has been their reference. Hence, they also claimed that the slave trade had not ended by the 1921 when this book was supposedly written, and they also forgot that by 1901-1902 the Aro had been destroyed. So if they contracted the Urban warriors and the Aro were destroyed in 1901-1902, how can the Urban warriors be raiding for slaves when those supposedly their sponsors, supposedly paying them, were already destroyed? So you see how their arguments go. And above all, the slave trade ended in that area between 1900 and 1901, and laws to that effect were actually made by the colonialists because they were transiting from slave trade, physical one, to mental slavery, which they implemented through colonialism. And so in this video, we look at how the Fulanis established their tribute system, that is where slaves were captured and sent as tributes to the Sultan of the Fulani at that time. Remember, the same way they do it today, that they have what they call oil blocks, which is distributed chiefly among military men. The army was a slave hunting militia, so that's how they are compensated. So little boys from Europe and America control all those men you see in what you call your Nigerian army or Cameroonian army or any of those armies in those regions. They were previously the slave hunters. And so the tribute system was such that every Negro community was required to send slaves to the emirs of the north, who were Fulanis. Remember, at that time Fulanis were classified as Arabs, and communities that failed to send their tributes were raided by the Fulbi soldiers, which turned or metamorphosed into what you call Nigerian or Cameroonian army today. You notice that most of the armies there claim their origin was from the West African Frontier Force, which is not accurate if you were to conduct the research yourself. In fact, if you were to make the research question to be, what was the origin of those armies, when were they established, by who, and who were the first recruits? Please do not take the stories they tell you, research them yourself, because they can tell you a lie today, but they can't tell you what was written about them in the past. They can't change those ones. So when you read what the story were back in the days and look at them from what they are saying today, you will see where their lies collapse very easily. And we shall ultimately ask questions like, where was the Aro as the Fulanis were collecting tributes in slaves from the entire sub-region? And they were there, they were supposedly selling slaves, but the tributes were going to the Fulanis. We want to use the video to further expose that the lies against the Aro Priests were concocted by the slave masters and his slave hunting partners and never true. And before we move forward, we may also remember that in one of those chronicles of lies by Adobe Tricia Nwobani, she alleged that before even the Europeans came to start buying and selling Negroes as slaves, that the Igbos were already buying and selling themselves, which is a lie when you apply common sense to it. Remember, for you to have slaves in your house, let's say you have 40 slaves, you have to feed them. The Igbos and the Negroes did not have commercial farming the way you know it. So there was nothing like having or selling themselves as slaves, because when you buy somebody as a slave, such a person is supposed to be coming to do something. What could they have been doing for the Negroes who were living in tiny huts, if we chose to put them that way? And then they will get 40 people. Those lies were told by the slave masters at that time, claiming that the Negroes did not live in any houses or anything. And when these Hamitic groups and other Negroid groups who are dark-skinned enslaved the Negroes, they tell you that it was being done by the same group, even though the slave master knew they were not the same people. But our interest is to show you that these people were lying, and they are mostly contracted by the slave masters to propagate those lies. So before we move forward, let us reference A Tropical Dependency, an outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan, with an account of the modern settlement of northern Nigeria by Flora L. Shaw, Lady Lugard, and this was published 1905. And there we are told that from time immemorial, the slave trade of the ancient world had its markets of supply in the Sudan. Sudan is a synonym for Nigritia or Nigeria or Negroland.